The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part 1. The imperial palace of Drakmor floated above the crimson clouds of Zerion Prime, like a crystalline mountain carved from starlight itself. Within its halls, beings from across the galaxy moved with careful precision, their every step measured to avoid the wrath of their sovereign. The Dragon Empress Sithara had ruled for 3,000 years, and in all that time, no voice had dared rise above a whisper in her presence. Sarah Chen had been working in the palace kitchens for 6 months, scrubbing pots and mopping floors with the same determination that had carried her through the academy back on Earth. She was one of only 12 humans employed in the entire palace, part of a cultural exchange program that most species considered a joke. Humans were too young, too primitive, too emotional for the refined atmosphere of the imperial court. They belonged in mining colonies or agricultural settlements, not among the elite of the galaxy. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived before dawn, her cleaning supplies rattling in their bucket as she navigated the servants' corridors. The palace was a maze of impossible geometry, its rooms folding in on themselves through spatial manipulation that made human architects weep. But Sarah had always been good with patterns, and she had mapped every shortcut and hidden passage in her section of the enormous structure. Today, however, her usual route was blocked. A massive Corellian guard, his reptilian features set in permanent scowl, stood before the service elevator that would take her to the upper floors. "Kitchen staff forbidden," he growled in the common tongue, his forked tongue flicking out to taste her scent. "Empress commands silence on entire 19th level," Sarah frowned. The 19th level contained the Empress's private chambers, a place so sacred that even the air recycling systems ran on silent mode. But it also housed the smaller preparation kitchens where delicate meals were assembled before being transported to the royal dining hall. If those kitchens went uncleaned, the health inspectors from the Galactic Food Authority would shut down the entire palace food service. "What about the prep kitchens?" Sarah asked, holding up her identification badge. "The molecular gastronomy lab hasn't been sanitized since yesterday." The guard's eyes narrowed to slits. "Human questioning orders?" "Human doing her job," Sarah replied evenly. She had learned that backing down to intimidation only made things worse in the palace hierarchy, unless you want to explain to head chef Margrave why his soufflé synthesizers are growing bacterial cultures. The mention of Chef Margrave made the guard hesitate. The tentacled master chef from Rigel 7 was known for his explosive temper and his direct line to the palace administrator. After a moment of consideration, the guard stepped aside. "1 hour," he rumbled, silent as space itself. Sarah nodded and slipped into the elevator. As it rose through the palace levels, she wondered what could have prompted such extreme security measures. The 19th level was already the most restricted area in the palace, accessible only to the Empress's personal staff and the highest-ranking nobles. What could require even greater silence? The elevator doors opened onto a corridor that felt different from the rest of the palace. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made Sarah's skin tingle. Crystals embedded in the walls pulsed with a soft blue light, and she could feel something else, something that reminded her of the way the air felt just before a thunderstorm back on Earth. She made her way to the preparation kitchen, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The kitchen was exactly as she had expected, pristine surfaces covered with the residue of yesterday's molecular experiments, delicate equipment that required careful cleaning to maintain its precision. Sarah set to work with practiced efficiency. She had learned to move like a ghost in the palace, her presence barely registered by the sensors that monitored every corridor. It was a skill that had served her well in a place where humans were considered an unwelcome novelty. She was halfway through sanitizing the molecular gastronomy equipment when she heard it. A sound so soft it was barely more than a breath, but in the enforced silence of the level it might as well have been a scream. Someone was crying. Sarah froze, her cleaning cloth suspended over a delicate crystalline beaker. The sound came again, a sob so filled with loneliness and despair that it made her chest ache. She followed the sound, her feet carrying her toward the source almost without conscious thought. The corridor led to a chamber she had never seen before, its entrance marked by symbols that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them directly. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap Sarah could see a figure seated on what appeared to be a throne made of living crystal. The Dragon Empress Zythera was nothing like Sarah had imagined. She had expected a monster, a creature of scales and fire that ruled through terror and intimidation. Instead, she saw a being of impossible beauty, her form shifting between human-like elegance and something far more ancient and powerful. Her scales caught the light like prisms, throwing rainbows across the chamber walls, but her face was streaked with tears that glowed like liquid starlight. The Empress sat alone in her private chamber, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Around her, the air shimmered with unspoken words, thoughts, and emotions that had been contained for so long they had begun to take on physical form. Sarah realized she was witnessing something that no other being in the galaxy had ever seen. The most powerful ruler in known space, completely and utterly alone. Without thinking, Sarah pushed the door open wider and stepped into the chamber. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, alarms should have sounded. Guards should have materialized from hidden passages. Instead, there was only silence and the soft sound of the Empress's crying. "Your Majesty?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the charged atmosphere of the chamber it carried like a bell. The Empress's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Hope? For a moment, the two beings stared at each other across an impossible gulf of species, power, and circumstance. Then the Empress spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's bones vibrate. "You can hear me?" The Empress whispered, her words filled with wonder and disbelief. "After all these centuries of silence, finally someone can hear me." The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The Dragon Empress, the most feared ruler in the galaxy, was speaking to her as if they were old friends reunited after a long separation. The chamber around them hummed with energy, and Sarah could feel something fundamental shifting in the very fabric of space around them. "I don't understand," Sarah said carefully, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Hear what, Your Majesty?" The Empress rose from her crystal throne, her movement fluid and graceful despite her obvious emotional distress. As she approached, Sarah could see that her scales weren't truly scales at all, but something far more complex. Each one was a miniature prism that contained entire galaxies of swirling light. "My thoughts," the Empress said, her voice carrying undertones that resonated in Sarah's chest. "My words, my emotions, my very essence. For 3 millennia, I have been trapped in this prison of silence, unable to communicate with any living being in my empire. They hear only what my translators choose to convey, only the commands and decrees they deem appropriate for imperial dignity." Sarah felt her brow furrow as she processed this information. "But surely your advisors, your ministers, they must be able to understand you directly." The Empress laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was bitter and hollow, like wind through empty caves. "My advisors hear what they expect to hear. My ministers interpret my silence as wisdom. My subjects believe that I am above the need for common communication. They have built an entire mythology around my supposed divine nature, never realizing that I am simply a prisoner in my own palace." Moving closer, the Empress extended one elegant hand toward Sarah. "But you, little human, you heard me crying. You understood my pain without translation or interpretation. How is this possible?" Sarah looked down at the offered hand, noting the way the light seemed to bend around the Empress's fingers. She reached out tentatively and was surprised to find that the Empress's skin was warm and surprisingly human-like in texture. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I just heard someone who sounded sad and lonely. Back on Earth, we have a saying, tears sound the same in every language." The contact between them sent a jolt through both beings. Sarah gasped as images flooded her mind, vast star systems bowing before a terrible beauty, councils of alien dignitaries speaking in hushed tones while their ruler sat silent and ignored, centuries upon centuries of isolation stretching out like an endless desert. The Empress pulled her hand back quickly, her eyes wide with amazement. "You saw," she whispered. "You actually saw my memories. This should not be possible. Humans are not telepathic. Your species lacks even the most basic psychic resonance." "Maybe that's exactly why it works," Sarah suggested, her mind racing as she tried to understand what had happened. "Back home we have old radio equipment that can sometimes pick up signals that newer, more sophisticated receivers can't detect. Maybe being primitive makes us compatible with something everyone else is too advanced to hear." The Empress considered this, her head tilted in a gesture that was surprisingly human-like despite her alien nature. The Council of Ministers believes that advanced telepathic abilities are a sign of evolutionary superiority. All of my advisors, all of my court, they communicate through layers of mental filtering and psychic protocol. Perhaps these very advances have made them deaf to my true voice. Sarah looked around the chamber, noting the way the crystals in the walls pulsed in rhythm with the Empress's emotional state. How long has it been since anyone really listened to you? 3,047 years, 215 days, 18 hours, the Empress replied without hesitation. The last being who could hear me directly was my mentor, Sage Karath of the Silver Nebula. When he passed into the eternal light, I thought I would never again know the simple pleasure of being understood. The weight of such isolation hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3,000 years of being surrounded by people who couldn't truly hear you, who interpreted your every word through their own assumptions and agendas. It was no wonder the Empress had been crying. That's horrible, Sarah said softly. No one should have to endure that kind of loneliness. And yet, the Empress continued, settling back onto her throne, I have endured it because I believed it was the price of power, the burden of rule that I must bear for the good of my people. But now, she looked at Sarah with an expression of dawning hope. Now I begin to wonder if there might be another way. Sarah moved closer, her cleaning supplies forgotten on the floor where she had dropped them. What do you mean? You work in the kitchens, do you not? You see the palace from a perspective that my advisors never experience. You understand the daily lives of those who serve, who work, who struggle to maintain this vast empire from below. Tell me, what do you see that they do not? The request caught Sarah off guard. No one in the palace had ever asked for her opinion on anything more complex than which cleaning solution worked best on crystalline surfaces. But as she thought about it, she realized she had indeed noticed things that seemed to escape the attention of the higher-ranking staff. The waste, she said finally. The incredible waste. Yesterday I saw them throw away enough food to feed a small colony because it wasn't arranged on the plates with perfect symmetry. The servants' quarters are overcrowded while half the guest wings sit empty. The lower-level staff work 16-hour shifts while the upper administrators spend most of their time in meetings about planning meetings. The Empress leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on Sarah's words. Continue. And the fear, Sarah added, warming to the topic. Everyone is so terrified of making a mistake that they've stopped taking any initiative at all. Yesterday, a water recycling unit broke down in the servants' quarters, but no one would authorize the repair because they were afraid you might disapprove of the expense. People were going without water for 3 days before I finally fixed it myself. You repaired a water recycling unit? The Empress seemed genuinely surprised. It was just a clogged filter, Sarah explained. But the maintenance request had to go through 17 different approval levels before anyone could touch it. By the time it reached someone with actual authority, the problem would have spread to the entire sanitation system. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new note of determination. For 3 millennia, I have ruled this empire through the interpretations and assumptions of others. I have made decisions based on information filtered through dozens of layers of bureaucracy and protocol. But if you can truly hear me, if you can be my voice as well as my ears, then perhaps it is time for things to change. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What are you suggesting, Your Majesty? The Empress smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had entered the chamber, it was a genuine expression of hope rather than despair. I am suggesting, little human, that you help me remember how to rule. The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part. The next morning brought chaos to the Imperial Palace that hadn't been seen in over a century. Sarah arrived at her usual time, only to find the servants' corridors buzzing with whispered conversations and nervous energy. Something had changed overnight and no one seemed to know quite what. The Empress has called for a full court assembly, muttered Kex, a blue-skinned Altarian who worked in the laundry systems. Not just the High Council, but everyone. Even the kitchen staff. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. After her encounter with the Empress the previous day, she had barely slept. The weight of what had transpired, the impossible connection they had shared, felt like a secret too dangerous to carry. Now it seemed that secret was about to be exposed. The Great Assembly Hall was a marvel of engineering that could accommodate beings from every corner of the galaxy. Its crystalline walls adjusted their transparency and geometric configuration based on the atmospheric needs of different species. As Sarah filed in with the other servants, she couldn't help but notice how the hall had been configured for maximum inclusion rather than the usual hierarchical arrangement that kept the lower-ranking staff hidden in alcoves. The Dragon Empress entered through a portal of pure light, her presence immediately commanding absolute silence. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, stars twinkling in their dark folds. But it was her expression that caught Sarah's attention. There was a determination there that hadn't existed before, a sense of purpose that radiated outward like heat from a forge. "Citizens of the Imperial Court," the Empress began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall through some form of acoustic manipulation that made it seem as if she were speaking directly into each listener's ear. "For too long, we have allowed the machinery of government to separate us from the reality of rule. Minister Vorthak, the prime advisor whose reptilian features dominated most official portraits, stepped forward with obvious confusion. "Your Imperial Majesty, if there has been some breach of protocol, we can address it through proper channels." The Empress held up one hand and Vorthak fell silent immediately. Sarah noticed that the gesture was different from the Empress's usual commands, less imperious, more communicative. It was as if she were asking for attention rather than demanding it. "Minister Vorthak speaks of protocol," the Empress continued. "But I speak of connection. For 3 millennia, our government has functioned through layers of interpretation and assumption. Decisions have been made based on what others believe I think, rather than what I actually communicate." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled crowd. This was not how imperial addresses were supposed to proceed. There should have been formal declarations, ceremonial announcements, carefully scripted interactions between the throne and the various court officials. Sarah watched from her position among the other servants as the Empress's gaze swept across the assembly. When those ancient eyes found hers, Sarah felt the same electric connection they had shared in the private chamber. But this time, instead of surprise, she sensed a deep calm and resolve. "Today," the Empress announced, "we begin a new experiment in governance. We will establish a direct communication protocol that bypasses the traditional hierarchies and allows for immediate response to the needs of our people." Minister Vorthak's confusion was evident to everyone in the hall. "Your Majesty, the existing communication systems have served the Empire well for millennia. If there are specific inefficiencies you wish to address—" "Yesterday," the Empress interrupted, "a water recycling unit in the servants' quarters was broken for 3 days because 17 different officials needed to approve a simple repair. In that same time period, the High Council spent 47 hours debating the proper shade of blue for ceremonial napkins." The silence that followed this statement was profound. Sarah realized that somehow, the Empress had access to information that should have been far below her notice. The broken recycling unit was exactly the kind of mundane detail that never reached the upper levels of palace administration. "Furthermore," the Empress continued, "our food preparation systems waste enough resources daily to sustain an entire colony ship, while our staff works extended shifts to maintain artificial standards that serve no practical purpose." Now the murmur that passed through the assembly carried notes of genuine shock. This level of operational detail was unprecedented in an imperial address. Minister Vorthak exchanged glances with several other high-ranking officials before speaking again. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, what source has provided you with such specific information about lower-level operational details?" The Empress smiled, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "The source," the Empress said, "is direct observation and communication with those who actually perform the work that sustains our empire. And today, we will formalize this new approach." She gestured, and Sarah felt an invisible force gently drawing her forward. Her feet moved almost without conscious direction, carrying her from the servants' section toward the center of the hall. Every eye in the assembly followed her progress, and she could hear the whispered questions beginning to build. "This is Sarah Chen," the Empress announced, as Sarah came to a stop before the crystal throne. "A maintenance technician from Earth who has demonstrated a remarkable ability to identify and solve practical problems that our traditional administrative systems have failed to address." "Minister," Vorthak's expression had shifted from confusion to alarm. "Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting that policy decisions should be influenced by—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to diplomatically express his horror at the idea of taking advice from a human kitchen worker. By those who understand the actual consequences of our decisions, the Empress finished. Yes, Minister Vorthak. That is exactly what I am suggesting. The Empress rose from her throne and moved to stand beside Sarah. The proximity made Sarah acutely aware of the power differential between them. She was a temporary worker from a species that most of the galaxy considered barely civilized, while the being beside her commanded resources that could reshape entire star systems. Effective immediately, the Empress declared, Sarah Chen is appointed as Special Advisor for Operational Reality. She will have direct access to all palace systems and personnel, and her recommendations regarding practical efficiency and resource allocation will carry the full weight of Imperial authority. The explosion of voices that followed this announcement threatened to overwhelm even the hall's sophisticated acoustic management systems. Sarah heard outrage, confusion, and in some cases what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Minister Vorthak was speaking rapidly to several other officials, his gestures becoming increasingly agitated. Through the chaos, Sarah felt the Empress's hand settle gently on her shoulder. The touch immediately calmed her racing heartbeat and cleared her mind of the panic that had been building. Are you ready for this? The Empress asked, her voice somehow reaching Sarah clearly despite the noise around them. Sarah looked out at the assembled court, at beings from dozens of species who commanded vast fleets and administered entire sectors of space. They were all staring at her with expressions ranging from bewilderment to open hostility. No, Sarah said honestly, but I think that might be exactly why it's necessary. The Empress squeezed her shoulder gently. Then let us begin. The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part, for within 48 hours of Sarah's appointment, the palace had transformed from a place of rigid protocol into something resembling organized chaos. Sarah found herself with an office that was larger than her entire apartment back on Earth, complete with holographic displays that could access every system in the Imperial network. The resistance to her new role was immediate and creative. Minister Vorthak had attempted to bury her under paperwork, sending requests for detailed reports on subjects ranging from historical precedent, analysis for custodial protocol modifications to xenobiological impact assessment of human dietary preferences on palace food. Services. When Sarah responded by implementing a streamlined, digital system that reduced report generation time by 70%, he switched to scheduling her for back-to-back meetings that would have kept her occupied for 18 hours a day. Sarah's solution was typically direct. She attended exactly one of these meetings, listened for 10 minutes to a discussion about whether the ceremonial towels in the guest quarters should be folded with 7 creases or 8, then stood up and announced that anyone who wanted her input on genuinely important matters could find her in the maintenance levels, actually solving problems. The Empress, meanwhile, had begun what she called reality walks, unscheduled tours through different sections of the palace where she could observe operations firsthand. These walks were causing panic throughout the administrative hierarchy, as they bypassed all the careful staging and preparation that usually preceded royal inspections. Sarah was reviewing efficiency reports from the waste management systems when her door chimed with an urgent priority signal. She looked up to find Kex, the Altarian laundry worker she had spoken with days earlier, standing in her doorway with an expression of barely contained terror. Special Advisor, Kex said, using Sarah's new title with obvious discomfort. We have a problem in the lower levels. A big problem. Sarah immediately stood and grabbed her equipment pack. Show me. They descended through levels of the palace that most of the court officials never saw. The mechanical spaces where the enormous machines that maintained artificial gravity, atmospheric processing, and structural integrity hummed with constant activity. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and heated metal, and the walls vibrated with barely contained energy. It started 3 hours ago, Kex explained as they hurried through a corridor lined with massive power conduits. The atmospheric processors began showing irregular readings, temperature fluctuations, pressure variations, chemical composition instabilities. Sarah frowned as she consulted the portable diagnostic device she had requisitioned from the engineering department. That doesn't make sense. These systems are designed with multiple redundancies. Even if one processor failed, the others should compensate automatically. They reached a vast chamber that housed the primary atmospheric control center, and Sarah immediately saw the problem. The central control unit was surrounded by dozens of technicians from various species, all speaking in urgent whispers while displays flashed warning signals in multiple colors. "Who's in charge here?" Sarah asked. A tall, thin being with multiple arms and crystalline eyes turned toward her. "Senior Engineer Kextal, and you are the human who has been causing such disruption in the upper levels." "I'm the human who fixes things," Sarah corrected. "What's the status?" Kextal's expression suggested he found the idea of reporting to a human deeply offensive, but the flashing warning displays around them left little room for political posturing. "The atmospheric processors are experiencing cascade failures across all 7 primary systems. We have implemented emergency protocols, but estimates suggest we have perhaps 6 hours before life support becomes critical." Sarah moved to the central control console and began examining the error logs. The data streams were almost incomprehensible in their complexity, but she could see patterns emerging from the chaos. "These aren't random failures," she said after several minutes of analysis. "The timing is too precise, too coordinated. Someone has deliberately sabotaged these systems." The reaction from the assembled engineers was immediate and vocal. Accusations of paranoia, demands for evidence, and heated discussions about the impossibility of infiltrating such secure systems filled the air. Sarah ignored the arguments and continued her analysis. The sabotage was sophisticated, designed to look like natural system degradation while actually creating a carefully orchestrated collapse. But there was something familiar about the programming patterns, something she had seen before. "Kextal," she said, cutting through the debates around her. "Show me the maintenance logs for the past month, specifically any modifications or updates to the core programming." The engineer's multiple arms moved across his console with practiced efficiency, calling up streams of data that scrolled past faster than Sarah could follow. But one entry caught her attention, a routine update that had been approved through proper channels and implemented by authorized personnel. "This update," Sarah pointed to the relevant entry. "Who authorized it?" "Minister Vorthak's office," Kextal replied. "Standard efficiency optimization protocol." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She pulled up the code for the supposed optimization and began analyzing its structure. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a minor adjustment to improve system response times. But buried deep within the code were hidden subroutines that would slowly degrade system performance over several weeks before triggering the cascade failure they were now experiencing. "This isn't sabotage by an outside infiltrator," Sarah announced to the room. "This is sabotage from within the government itself." The silence that followed her statement was profound. Accusations of treason within the palace hierarchy were not made lightly, especially not by a human who had been appointed to her position just days earlier. "That's a serious charge," Kextal said carefully. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" Sarah downloaded the relevant code sections to her portable device and began highlighting the hidden functions. The sabotage code is designed to be activated by a specific trigger signal. Once activated, it creates a system crisis that would require emergency powers to resolve. Powers that would naturally fall to the senior administration. Specifically, whoever convinced the Empress that her new advisory structure was too dangerous to continue. As if summoned by her words, Minister Vorthak appeared in the chamber doorway, flanked by palace security guards. His reptilian features were set in an expression of concerned authority. "I came as soon as I heard about the crisis," he announced to the room. "Fortunately, we have contingency plans for exactly this type of system failure. With the Empress's permission, we can implement emergency protocols that will bypass these failing systems and restore full functionality within hours. Emergency protocols that would require suspending my advisory position and returning to the previous administrative structure?" Sarah asked. Vorthak's eyes narrowed slightly. "Whatever measures are necessary to ensure the safety of the palace and its inhabitants." Sarah held up her portable device, displaying the analyzed code for everyone in the chamber to see. "Including the measures you put in place 3 weeks ago when you authorized this efficiency optimization." The change in Vorthak's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The concerned authority shifted to something harder and more calculating. "You're suggesting that I would endanger thousands of lives to make a political point?" he asked. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replied. "I'm stating a fact. The code contains your personal authorization signature, embedded in a way that can't be forged or transferred. You didn't just approve this update, you wrote it. The tension in the chamber had become almost physically tangible. Security guards were looking uncertainly between Sarah and their superior, while the engineering staff watched with expressions of growing alarm. Vorthak was quiet for a long moment, his reptilian features unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation. The Empire has survived for over 50,000 years under a system of careful checks and balances, he said. The introduction of unpredictable elements threatens the stability that has kept trillions of beings safe and prosperous. So you decided to create a crisis that would eliminate those elements, Sarah said, even if it meant risking the lives of everyone in the palace. The risk was calculated and minimal, Vorthak replied. The emergency protocols would have restored functionality before any permanent damage occurred. A small price to pay for preserving the natural order. Sarah looked around the chamber at the assembled engineers and guards. The natural order that includes 3-day delays for simple repairs while people go without water? The natural order that wastes enough resources daily to feed entire colonies? She turned back to Vorthak, her voice carrying a new note of authority that surprised even her. Your natural order wasn't stable. It was stagnant, and stagnation kills empires just as surely as revolution does. The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part. The trial of Minister Vorthak became the most watched judicial proceeding in the galaxy's recorded history. Representatives from every major species attended, not just to witness the downfall of one of the Empire's most powerful officials, but to understand how a human kitchen worker had managed to uncover a conspiracy that had eluded the Empire's sophisticated intelligence networks. Sarah found herself testifying before the High Court of Imperial Justice, a tribunal comprised of the galaxy's most respected legal minds. The courtroom was a marvel of architecture that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing beings from different realms of reality to participate in the proceedings. The evidence is clear, Sarah explained to the assembled judges as holographic displays showed the sabotage code in 3-dimensional detail. The atmospheric crisis was engineered specifically to create a situation where emergency powers would be necessary, powers that would inevitably fall to the existing administrative hierarchy. Judge Kiraneth of the Spiral Nebula, whose crystalline form refracted light into complex patterns of meaning, posed a question that resonated through multiple harmonic frequencies. But what we do not understand, Advisor Chen, is how you were able to detect such sophisticated sabotage when our own security systems registered nothing unusual. Sarah had been dreading this question, knowing that the answer would reveal the true nature of her connection with the Empress. I think it has to do with perspective, Your Honor. The sabotage was designed to be invisible to systems that expect certain patterns of behavior. But humans don't share those expectations. Elaborate, requested Judge Vorthak's defense attorney, a massive being whose form seemed to be composed entirely of shifting geometric patterns. Human technology developed differently from galactic standard, Sarah explained. We had to build our systems to be robust rather than elegant, functional rather than beautiful. When I analyze code, I'm not looking for sophisticated patterns or elegant solutions. I'm looking for things that work and things that don't work. She gestured to the code display, highlighting sections that appeared perfectly normal to most observers. To a galactic programmer, this code looks like a masterpiece of efficiency. Every function is optimized, every variable precisely calculated. But to a human engineer, it looks like someone trying too hard to hide something. The defense attorney pressed further. Are you suggesting that human primitive development makes you superior to galactic civilization? Not superior, Sarah corrected. Just different. Sometimes being the least sophisticated species in the room gives you advantages that sophistication can't provide. Throughout her testimony, Sarah was acutely aware of the Empress sitting in her place of honor above the courtroom. Their connection had grown stronger over the weeks since the crisis, allowing them to communicate not just through words but through shared understanding that transcended language entirely. The Empress had initially been reluctant to reveal the true nature of their telepathic bond, fearing it would undermine Sarah's credibility. But as the proceedings continued, it became clear that their connection was actually the key to understanding how the conspiracy had been uncovered. During a recess, Sarah found herself alone with the Empress in the private chambers adjacent to the courtroom. The space was designed for contemplation, its walls displaying slowly shifting patterns that were supposed to promote calm reflection. "They're going to ask about us," Sarah said without preamble, "about how I really knew to look for the sabotage code." The Empress nodded, her expression troubled. "I know, and I fear that revealing our connection will do more harm than good. The court already struggles to accept that a human could outsmart their finest intellects. If they learn that you had access to my thoughts and memories, they will dismiss your achievements as mere telepathic advantage." "But it wasn't telepathic advantage," Sarah protested. "Yes, I could sense your emotions and share your experiences, but the actual detective work, the code analysis, the problem solving, that was all me. The connection just helped me understand what questions to ask." "I know this," the Empress replied gently. "And you know this. But will the court see it that way?" Before Sarah could answer, the chamber doors opened and Judge Kiraneth entered, her crystalline form casting rainbow patterns on the walls. "Your Imperial Majesty, Advisor Chen," the judge said with formal courtesy. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there are questions that must be addressed before we can proceed." The Empress gestured for the judge to continue. "The defense has raised concerns about the nature of Advisor Chen's appointment and her subsequent investigation. They suggest that there may be extraordinary circumstances that have not been disclosed to the court." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment she had been dreading. "What kind of extraordinary circumstances?" the Empress asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Telepathic influence," Judge Kiraneth said bluntly. "The defense claims that no being without psychic abilities could have uncovered such sophisticated sabotage without assistance. They are prepared to argue that Advisor Chen's investigation was guided by telepathic communication that violates the principles of independent legal proceeding." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. If the court determined that Sarah's investigation had been compromised by telepathic influence, not only would Vorthak's conviction be overturned, but Sarah herself could face charges of fraud and conspiracy. "Judge Kiraneth," the Empress said slowly, "what would the court require to verify the independence of Advisor Chen's investigation?" "Complete telepathic examination by a neutral telepath," the judge replied. "Full mental transparency to verify that her conclusions were reached through her own analytical processes rather than through psychic guidance." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The kind of examination the judge was describing would expose not just her connection with the Empress, but every thought, memory, and motivation she had experienced during the investigation. "I'll do it," Sarah said before the Empress could object. "Sarah," the Empress said sharply, "you don't understand what you're agreeing to. A complete telepathic examination is invasive beyond your comprehension. It will expose not just your investigation methods, but your entire mental landscape. Every private thought, every personal memory, every emotion you've ever experienced." "I know," Sarah replied, "but it's the only way to prove that my work was legitimate. And more importantly, it's the only way to ensure that Vorthak faces justice for what he did." Judge Kiraneth regarded them both carefully. "This is not a decision to be made lightly. Once the examination begins, there is no way to limit its scope or protect any aspect of your mental privacy." Sarah looked at the Empress, seeing her own determination reflected in those ancient eyes. "Your Majesty, for 3,000 years you've been isolated by the assumption that others couldn't understand you. I won't let that isolation be used as a weapon against the truth." The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions that Sarah could feel echoing in her own mind. Finally she nodded. "Very well," she said to Judge Kiraneth. "Advisor Chen consents to full telepathic examination. But I have one condition." "Yes, Your Majesty?" The Empress smiled, and Sarah felt a surge of fierce pride and protectiveness that she realized was coming from the other woman. "The examination will be conducted in open court, with full documentation for public record. If Sarah's mind is to be laid bare, let the entire galaxy witness the courage and integrity that allowed a human to save an empire." The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part. 6. The telepathic examination was scheduled for the following day, but word of what was about to happen spread throughout the galaxy within hours. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that threatened to eclipse the actual trial. News feeds from every major species were broadcasting speculation about what the examination might reveal. While legal scholars debated the implications of such unprecedented transparency in galactic jurisprudence, Sarah spent the evening before the examination in the palace gardens, trying to find some peace among the bioluminescent plants that had been collected from dozens of different worlds. The garden was one of the few places in the palace where the artificial nature of their environment gave way to something more organic and alive. She wasn't surprised when the Empress found her there, sitting beside a small pond where phosphorescent fish swam in patterns that resembled constellations. Second thoughts? The Empress asked, settling gracefully onto the bench beside Sarah. Hundreds of them, Sarah admitted, but not about doing it. About what happens afterward. What do you mean? Sarah gestured toward the palace rising above them, its crystalline spires reflecting the light of 3 moons. All of this, everything we've been building together, it's been possible because people didn't really understand the nature of our connection. Tomorrow, they're going to see everything. They'll know exactly how we've been communicating, how our minds link together, how your experiences have shaped my understanding. The Empress considered this quietly. Are you concerned they will see it as manipulation? I'm concerned they'll see it as something that makes me less than I am, Sarah replied. For my entire life, humans have been treated as the junior species in galactic civilization. We're tolerated, sometimes even liked, but never really respected. Tomorrow, when they see that my insights came partly from your ancient wisdom and experience, they might decide that proves we're not capable of independent thought. But that isn't what happened, the Empress said firmly. Yes, our connection allowed you to understand context that would have taken years to learn through conventional means. But the actual problem-solving, the logical deduction, the creative thinking that uncovered Vorthak's conspiracy, all of that came from your human mind. Sarah looked up at her, seeing the starlight reflected in her prismatic scales. How can you be so certain? The Empress smiled. Because I have had access to the finest minds in the galaxy for 3 millennia. Brilliant strategists, master engineers, philosophers whose thoughts span cosmic timescales. But none of them saw what you saw. None of them made the connections that you made. The telepathic link didn't give you intelligence, Sarah, it gave you information. What you did with that information was entirely your own achievement. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the phosphorescent fish trace their eternal patterns in the water. Finally, Sarah spoke again. What happens if the examination goes badly? If they decide our connection invalidates everything we've accomplished? Then we will deal with the consequences, the Empress replied. But I don't believe that will happen. Tomorrow the galaxy will see something they have never seen before. The complete mental transparency of a being who chose courage over safety, truth over comfort. They will see a human mind in all its chaotic, creative, stubborn glory, and I think they will be amazed by what they discover. The next morning, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Representatives from species Sarah had never heard of had traveled vast distances to witness the examination. The air hummed with translation fields working overtime to accommodate dozens of different communication methods. At the center of it all sat Examiner Threnth, a being from the Veil Nebula whose species had evolved pure telepathic abilities. Threnth's form was barely corporeal, shifting between states of matter as easily as breathing. They were considered the most skilled and impartial telepath in known space. Advisor Chen, Threnth spoke directly into Sarah's mind, their mental voice carrying harmonics that made her consciousness ring like a bell. Are you prepared to begin? Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing heartbeat. Around the courtroom, recording devices captured every moment for posterity. The examination will proceed in stages, Threnth explained, both mentally and aloud for the benefit of the court. First, we will establish the baseline of your mental patterns. Then we will review your memories of the investigation. Finally, we will analyze the nature of any external influences on your thought processes. The first contact was gentle, like warm water flowing through her mind. Sarah could feel Threnth exploring the structure of her thoughts, mapping the neural pathways that made up her consciousness. It was intimate in a way she hadn't expected, but not unpleasant. Fascinating, Threnth murmured, their mental voice tinged with genuine surprise. Human cognitive architecture is far more complex than our studies had suggested. Through the link, Sarah could sense Threnth sharing their observations with the court in real time. The human mind, they explained, processed information through multiple parallel systems that operated simultaneously, creating redundancy and flexibility that more specialized species lacked. Beginning memory review, Threenoth announced, and suddenly Sarah was reliving her first encounter with the Empress. The court could see everything: her nervousness, her empathy for the crying figure on the throne, her decision to breach protocol out of simple human compassion. As the examination progressed, Sarah felt the court's collective attention like a weight on her consciousness. They witnessed her analytical process as she discovered the sabotage code, saw how she connected seemingly unrelated pieces of information through intuitive leaps that even she couldn't fully explain. But most importantly, they experienced the nature of her connection with the Empress. The telepathic link wasn't a method of control or manipulation as some had suggested. Instead, it was revealed to be a form of emotional resonance that allowed Sarah to understand the context and consequences of her discoveries without losing her independent analytical abilities. The connection functions as an amplifier rather than a director, Threenoth explained to the court. The human's natural problem-solving capabilities are enhanced by access to additional information, but the core thought processes remain entirely her own. As the examination reached its conclusion, Sarah felt something unexpected happening. The transparency that had initially terrified her was becoming liberating. For the first time in her life, she was being seen and understood completely, without filters or prejudices. The examination is complete, Threenoth announced, withdrawing gently from Sarah's consciousness. The record will show that Advisor Chen's investigation was conducted through legitimate analytical methods, enhanced but not directed by her telepathic connection to Her Imperial Majesty. Her conclusions were reached through independent reasoning applied to information that was available through conventional channels. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of voices, but Sarah barely heard them. She was looking at the Empress, seeing tears of pride streaming down her face like liquid starlight. Judge Kiraneth called for order and addressed the court. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Minister Vorthak's sabotage was uncovered through legitimate investigative methods. Furthermore, this examination has revealed capabilities in human cognitive processing that may require us to reconsider our understanding of this species' potential contributions to galactic civilization. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, she realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in the trial, not just in the Empire, but in how humanity would be perceived throughout the galaxy. The human who had started as a kitchen worker had become the bridge between an isolated Empress and her people. But more than that, she had proven that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from sophistication or ancient knowledge, but from the simple courage to listen with an open heart and speak the truth regardless of the consequences. The Dragon Empress spoke in silence, until a human maid answered her part. 3 years after the trial that changed everything, Sarah stood in what had once been her cleaning closet, now transformed into the central operations hub for Imperial reform. The small space had been expanded through dimensional engineering into a complex that rivaled the size of the original palace, filled with beings from every corner of the galaxy, working on projects that would have been unimaginable under the old system. The transformation of the Empire hadn't happened overnight. Minister Vorthak's conviction had been just the beginning of a process that revealed layers of corruption and inefficiency that had accumulated over millennia. But with the Empress's direct communication abilities restored, and Sarah's practical problem-solving approach guiding the reforms, change had come faster than anyone had thought possible. The latest efficiency reports from the outer colonies, announced Kex, who had been promoted from laundry services to Director of Resource Optimization. The blue-skinned Altarian handed Sarah a data tablet showing metrics that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Food, waste down by 84% across all their administrative levels, Sarah read aloud. Response time for maintenance requests reduced from an average of 6 days to 4 hours. Colonial autonomy initiatives showing improved satisfaction ratings in 97% of participating systems. She looked up to find the Empress entering the hub, her presence causing the usual ripple of respectful acknowledgement from the staff. But there was none of the fearful silence that had once accompanied her appearances. The beings working in the hub had learned to see her not as a distant, incomprehensible deity, but as a leader who was genuinely interested in their insights and contributions. The Andromedans have agreed to our proposal, the Empress announced, settling into the chair that had been specially designed to accommodate her unique physiology. They're willing to implement the new communication protocols in their sector as a pilot program. Sarah felt a surge of excitement that she knew the Empress shared through their mental link. The Andromedan Confederation had been one of the most resistant to the imperial reforms, viewing them as potentially destabilizing to the galactic balance of power. Their agreement to participate was a major breakthrough. What convinced them? Sarah asked. The efficiency data from our own implementation, the Empress replied. When bureaucratic overhead drops by 70% while service quality improves, even the most conservative administrators take notice. The reforms had indeed produced remarkable results. The palace that had once employed thousands of people to manage simple tasks now operated with a fraction of the staff, while providing better services and responding more quickly to problems. The savings in resources and labor had been redirected to colony development, scientific research, and infrastructure improvements that benefited trillions of beings across the empire. But perhaps more importantly, the reforms had changed the fundamental relationship between the government and the governed. The rigid hierarchies that had once separated rulers from subjects had been replaced with communication, networks that allowed for direct feedback and rapid response to changing needs. There's something else, the Empress continued, her expression taking on a more serious tone. The Galactic Council has formally requested that we present our reform model to the Assembly of Civilizations next month. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar nervousness. The Assembly of Civilizations was the closest thing the galaxy had to a unified government, bringing together representatives from every major species and political entity. For them to consider adopting reforms based on human insights was both thrilling and terrifying. They're really ready to listen to ideas from the kitchen staff? Sarah asked with a wry smile. They're ready to listen to ideas that work, the Empress corrected. Your species has something that the rest of us seem to have lost over the millennia of technological advancement: the ability to see obvious solutions to complex problems. Over the past 3 years, Sarah had come to understand that this ability wasn't unique to her, but rather a characteristic of human cognition that had been overlooked by galactic civilization. Humans approached problems differently because they had evolved differently, developing practical intelligence rather than specialized abilities. I've been thinking about that, Sarah said, moving to the central holographic display that showed a real-time map of the Empire. About why human approaches work so well in situations like this. She gestured, and the display zoomed in to show a detailed breakdown of resource flows throughout the Imperial systems. Every other species in the galaxy developed specific advantages, she continued. The Corellians became master warriors, the Altarians developed perfect memory, the Crystalline Collective achieved mathematical precision beyond imagination. But humans never specialized. We remained generalists. The Empress leaned forward, intrigued by this line of thinking. Continue. In a complex system like galactic civilization, specialists create elegant solutions to specific problems, Sarah explained. But they often can't see how their solutions interact with systems outside their area of expertise. Generalists might not be the best at any one thing, but they're good at seeing the big picture and understanding how different pieces fit together. Around them, the hub continued its constant activity as beings from dozens of species worked on projects ranging from agricultural optimization to interstellar communication protocols. The diversity itself was part of the solution. By bringing together different perspectives and abilities, they had created something greater than the sum of its parts. The assembly presentation, the Empress said thoughtfully. What do you think we should focus on? Sarah considered the question carefully. The assembly would be looking for concrete benefits, measurable improvements that justified the disruption of implementing such fundamental changes. The numbers tell part of the story, she said finally. Efficiency improvements, resource savings, response time reductions. But I think the real selling point is something harder to quantify, which is hope, Sarah said simply. For the first time in millennia, people throughout the Empire feel like they can actually influence their government. They can report problems and see them fixed. They can suggest improvements and watch them implemented. They're not just subjects anymore, they're participants. The Empress was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Through their mental connection, Sarah could sense her reviewing memories of the past 3 years. contrasting them with the centuries of isolation and misunderstanding that had preceded them. "There's something I need to tell you," the Empress said finally, "something I've been reluctant to share." Sarah felt a flutter of concern. In their years of working together, the Empress had become completely transparent about her thoughts and feelings. For her to hold something back suggested it was significant. "The connection between us," the Empress continued, "it's been changing, growing stronger, but also spreading." "What do you mean?" "I've begun to sense other humans in the same way I sense you. Faintly but clearly enough to recognize the same cognitive patterns, the same problem-solving approaches. I think your species may be more telepathically capable than anyone realized. You just needed the right catalyst to awaken those abilities." Sarah felt a chill of excitement run through her. The implications were staggering. If humans could develop telepathic abilities, if they could form the same kind of connection with other species that she had formed with the Empress, the possibilities for galactic cooperation were limitless. "How many?" she asked. "Dozens so far. Humans working in various positions throughout the Empire, most of them in practical hands-on roles. Engineers, technicians, medical staff, agricultural specialists, all showing the same pattern of enhanced problem-solving when they're given access to broader context and communication." Sarah walked to the observation window that looked out over the palace grounds, where beings from hundreds of species worked and lived together in harmony. That would have been impossible under the old system. "So this is just the beginning," she said softly. The Empress joined her at the window, her presence warm and reassuring. "This is just the beginning. In a generation or two, there may be humans serving as communication bridges throughout galactic civilization, helping different species understand each other in ways that have never been possible before." As they watched the bustling activity below, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a kitchen worker, invisible and unimportant in the vast machinery of Empire. But by simply being willing to listen, to care, and to act on what she heard, she had become part of something that was reshaping the galaxy itself. "Ready to change the universe again?" the Empress asked with a smile that sparkled like distant stars. Sarah laughed, feeling the weight and wonder of infinite possibility stretching out before them. "With your help, I think we can handle it." Outside the window, the 3 moons of Zerion Prime were rising over the palace, their light creating patterns on the crystal spires that had stood for millennia as symbols of isolation and power. But now they reflected something different, the warm glow of connection, understanding, and hope. Sarah said simply, "For the first time in millennia, people throughout the Empire feel like they can actually influence their government. They can report problems and see them fixed. They can suggest improvements and watch them implemented. They're not just subjects anymore, they're participants." The Empress was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Through their mental connection, Sarah could sense her reviewing memories of the past 3 years, contrasting them with the centuries of isolation and misunderstanding that had preceded them. "There's something I need to tell you," the Empress said finally. "Something I've been reluctant to share." Sarah felt a flutter of concern. In their years of working together, the Empress had become completely transparent about her thoughts and feelings. For her to hold something back suggested it was significant. "The connection between us," the Empress continued, "it's been changing, growing stronger, but also spreading." "What do you mean?" "I've begun to sense other humans in the same way I sense you. Faintly but clearly enough to recognize the same cognitive patterns, the same problem-solving approaches. I think your species may be more telepathically capable than anyone realized. You just needed the right catalyst to awaken those abilities." Sarah felt a chill of excitement run through her. The implications were staggering. If humans could develop telepathic abilities, if they could form the same kind of connection with other species that she had formed with the Empress, the possibilities for galactic cooperation were limitless. "How many?" she asked. "Dozens so far. Humans working in various positions throughout the Empire, most of them in practical, hands-on roles. Engineers, technicians, medical staff, agricultural specialists, all showing the same pattern of enhanced problem-solving when they're given access to broader context and communication." Sarah walked to the observation window that looked out over the palace grounds, where beings from hundreds of species worked and lived together in harmony that would have been impossible under the old system. "So this is just the beginning," she said softly. The Empress joined her at the window, her presence warm and reassuring. This is just the beginning. In a generation or two, there may be humans serving as communication bridges throughout galactic civilization, helping different species understand each other in ways that have never been possible before. As they watched the bustling activity below, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a kitchen worker, invisible and unimportant in the vast machinery of empire, but by simply being willing to listen, to care, and to act on what she heard, she had become part of something that was reshaping the galaxy itself. Ready to change the universe again? The Empress asked with a smile that sparkled like distant stars. Sarah laughed, feeling the weight and wonder of infinite possibility stretching out before them. With your help? I think we can handle it. Outside the window, the 3 moons of Zarian Prime were rising over the palace, their light creating patterns on the crystal spires that had stood for millennia as symbols of isolation and power. But now they reflected something different, the warm glow of connection, understanding, and hope that promised a future brighter than any empire had ever known. The Dragon Empress had spoken in silence for 3,000 years, but when a human maid finally answered her, their conversation had become the foundation for a new age of galactic civilization. And this, Sarah realized with quiet satisfaction, was truly just the beginning of the story they would write together.